Hi, this is Rob from netwatch.me. Thank you for joining the webcast. As many of you know, I work for Nutanix and Technical Alliances, and part of my job, or really cool part of my job, is to work on side projects that really enhance our ecosystem. And this particular case is one I've been working on for the last few months with a development team, and this is a Nutanix app for Splunk. Now, if many of you don't know, Splunk is basically a very big data or log aggregation tool that you can as a framework to build out some really cool dashboarding. And what we've done is built out some really cool, basically Prism dashboard inside of Splunk, and then also be able to give you the ability to look at those logs in really a cool and logical manner. And what I'm going to do is actually walk you through getting this thing set up and working with a real Nutanix cluster. So sit back and hang tight, and we'll get started shortly. So before we get started, it's a good idea we understand the requirements. In my case, I'm actually running my Splunk instance on Linux, particularly CentOS. Um, but if you're running this on Windows, this is the instructions would be very similar because once you actually install Splunk, everything is web driven at that point. So to reiterate, you want to have a new or existing Splunk instance running 6.2 or higher. You also want to have a Splunk account. This allows you to essentially download the Splunk app from the Splunk base, which is the Splunk App Store. Um, and it is recommended to deploy this to a distributed deployment, meaning you separate the components for workload reasonings. But in a lab environment, we're going to have all these components on one VM. So minimum requirements in that case would be 2 cores, 8 gigs of RAM, 60 gigs of space. You want to have a Nutanix cluster because we want to be able to actually present that Nutanix data available running, and you want to have that cluster running NOS 4.5 or above. We want to have PuTTY access to that cluster so we can actually change that syslog settings and send all that um, syslog or log data like Curator and Prism and Stargate, etc., over to Splunk so we can ingest that so we can look at that within Splunk. And you want to remember to always open those syslog ports. By default, a lot of Linux or even Windows have the firewalls turned on by default. So if we're actually sending syslog data over, and if you don't actually have those firewalls off, we're not going to actually see any of that stuff within Splunk. So very important things to remember. Once you've actually met all those required, we're ready to get started. Let's get rolling. And to review my lab setup, my Splunk instance is running 2 cores, 8 gigs of RAM, 60 gigs of space. My Nutanix cluster that will be we'll be receiving syslog data is a cluster running NOS 4.6.02. Actually, I just upgraded to 4.6.02, so we should have actually some interesting data pumping into syslog. As typically you're rebooting things after during a NOS upgrade and stuff, so it's generating a lot of syslog data for a little while. Um, the particular cluster that we're going to actually gathering information on is a NX3060 G4. In particular, is a 3460 G4, which is 4 nodes. I have each node has two 16-core processors, 256 gigs of RAM per node. Each node also has two 400 gig SSDs and four 1 terabyte HDDs, which in the case of my particular cluster is around 15 terabytes aggregate across the nodes, give or take, depending on the storage, the technology you're using on the containers. And to further elaborate on the lab setup, so as you can see here from the bottom up, we are going to be setting up syslog to essentially ingest data into Splunk. Um, and that syslog data will have all that information around Prism, Curator, Stargate, etc. And then essentially Splunk is actually calling out to our Nutanix cluster via REST API to present our Prism dashboard within Splunk so we can consume it within this Splunk web interface. So moving on, it's good to understand how the Nutanix app for Splunk works. As you can see on your screen, I'm actually on Splunk base, which is Splunk's app store. And I'm actually going to type in Nutanix. And what you'll notice is that there are two results that show up. These are actually two components that make up the Nutanix app for Splunk. One is the actual dashboarding app, which is actually going to show all those metrics, those great metrics that you typically would see in the Prism dashboard. And now you can actually see them within Splunk within the Splunk interface. And then the second one is actually called the TA for Nutanix Prism. And that is actually responsible for the ingestion of data, how it's formed, and how and providing insight to that dashboard essentially. Um, be provided that that dashboard basically leverages our REST API, and it goes at different intervals. By default, it's 900 seconds, but it is user configurable. So what that means is that data that can be at a different refresh rate, so whatever you want on that dashboard. Okay, moving on to the fun part. So as you can see here on my screen, this is actually a default instance I installed of Splunk. I'm actually going to log into it as admin and change me, which is the default for a default instance, whether you're on Windows or Linux. Um, be aware there's two ways to actually install our app onto Splunk. One way is actually go directly to the Splunk-based App Store. Again, you do have to have a login and download the Prism Dab Splunk app and the actual TA. And then what you do is you would go into this, once you log into the main Splunk dashboard, you click on up in the upper left-hand corner on near next to apps, there's a little sprocket. And what you'll notice in the middle up here in the upper left is install app from file. And you can do it that way, or the other way to do it is actually browse directly to the App Store and directly install it right into the instance, which is the way I'm actually going to do it, and the easiest way. So I'm going to type in Nutanix, and what you'll notice, there's two. So we're going to install the TA first, which is the ingestion of data. You'll notice that you do need a login to Splunk Base to install this. So I'm actually going to log in here and accept the terms. And as you can see, it says as your app's being downloaded, and now it's successfully installed. Now I'm actually going to install the Prism dashboard inside of Splunk, and you notice that it's remembering my username and password, and I'm accepting my terms here, and I'm logging and installing. And again, it was successfully installed. Once you've done that, if you go to the top very left-hand corner and just click on the Splunk icon there, or the Splunk name, um, what you'll notice is the Nutanix Prism app for Splunk. But if you click on it now, there'll be absolutely no data because we haven't configured any of the inputs, nor have we configured any of the syslog data that would be coming into it. So what we're going to do next is actually configure data inputs. So if you click on the top where it says settings, you'll notice it says something that says data inputs. And this is where you're going to need to know your cluster IP. Um, what's important is you can either point to the CVM or you can point to the cluster IP for all that represents all your CVMs, which is obviously better to do because if you have an individual CVM go down for some reason, you're not going to get that refresh happen on the dashboard if it happens to probe it. If you hit the cluster IP, we essentially are hitting a highly resilient infrastructure to look at Prism stats. So what you'll notice here on the data inputs is that you'll notice that there are some inputs that are unique to Nutanix here. Sorry about that. Nutanix Prism alerts, Nutanix Prism API architecture, Nutanix Prism API cluster, Nutanix Prism API events, and Nutanix Prism API health. Now, what you'll notice is that we have to hit add new. And what this does is allow you to add the cluster that you want to monitor in here. And what you have to do is I'm actually going to go through and I'm going to hit add new to health. And we'll do one right now and give you an example of it. But basically the inputs are all the same in all of them. You have to do one for each, one to actually represent in a cluster. So you do one for health, one for events, one for API cluster, one for API architecture, and one for API alerts, and then that would represent one cluster that we're monitoring. So in this case, it wants to know the name of the entity that you're monitoring. In my case, um, I have my is a Hyper-V cluster that I'm going to be representing during this demo. So what we're going to do is type in NTNX, and I've called mine Hyper-V like that, NTNX Hyper-V, and it wants to know the username and password to your Prism API interface. Again, this is the password to Prism, so if you're having AD authentication, you could use that within Prism, or if you're using the default username and password, or if you have your own username scheme within Prism. As long as it has the ability, which basically is a cluster admin to leverage the API interface, you're good to go. So in this case, I'm actually going to use the default credentials that we have with Nutanix when you buy a Nutanix cluster. And now it wants the IP, and this, again, we're going to put in the cluster IP. In my case, it's 10.20.28.10, oops, I'm sorry, 134. Um, and now it wants to know the port. And again, this should not change unless you have a custom port set to REST API. And now what you'll notice is a more settings box. By default, I think I'd mentioned this early on, is that it defaults, it probes and intervals the REST API to get basically show Prism alerts or Prism dashboard alerts every 900 seconds. Now you can actually change this more frequently depending on your needs. In my case, I'm actually going to change this to every 120 seconds, so every 2 minutes, we're actually going to probe here and get actual health. Again, you don't have to touch any of these other variables, these source types and host. And index are all automatically set unless you're doing specific indexes or specific ways you want to configure your data to come in. This is actually automatically set and put in the appropriate databases and tables, etc. So I'm actually just going to change to 120 seconds and hit next. And you'll notice that it says module import has been created successfully. At that point, you can go back and do the rest of those inputs. I like to actually just click on settings, data inputs again. And what you'll notice here is it says 1. And what's great about that is that now we have 1 configured. Now we have to do 4 more to go to get 1 cluster actually configured so we can start getting some dashboard stats. So I've fast forwarded this a little bit and actually added all the inputs. Now be aware you may want to adjust some of the times. I've set like architecture, you wouldn't need to refresh every 120 seconds because that wouldn't change very often. You can set that to, the default on that is 3600 seconds, which in my opinion would probably be pretty sufficient for doing that. So now once you've actually configured the data inputs, now you're actually ready to look at the actual dashboard. But just be aware we're not done yet. So I say we're not done because you actually have to go in once you've actually added each one of these and actually enable them. They do not enable by default. So if you notice, if you go in here, they'll show as disabled under status. And I'm actually going to enable them. So I'm going to go and enable them now and just hold on one moment. So I just whizzed through and enabled all the different inputs to be enabled. So within about 30 seconds to a minute, you'll actually see it show up in actually the dashboard. So I'm actually going to go click on apps, click on Nutanix Prism app for Splunk, and give the minute for the dashboard to render. And as you can see, the dashboard renders properly. And as you can see, ta-da, Hyper-V shows up here. Now, again, if you'd actually had multiple clusters, they would show different hypervisors here. Shows the version, all the stuff you would typically see, the metrics you would see in the Prism dashboard, consolidated. What you'll also notice is at the very top left-hand corners, it says Nutanix syslog. This is where you can actually start searching the actually syslog data, but that stuff is not going to show up because why? We haven't configured syslog. So that's actually what's coming up next. So, but at least now we've actually configured this, the actual Prism dashboard. Again, you can go in here and readjust all your data inputs to change the intervals of how often you want to refresh this data on this on there. And this is more of a end user or an administrator call of how often they want this data refreshed. So now let's move on to doing actual configuring the cluster for sending the syslog data over to Splunk. And now on to configuring syslog. So here's some of my notes that I have on configuring syslog, and I'm going to walk you through it before we get started, and then I'll quickly kind of go through and do this in a putty session. So the first thing you want to do when you're configuring syslog is actually disable the syslog. Um, this essentially so you can, wherever, if it's sending data now, we want to disable it so we can configure it. The next thing we do in configuring syslog, and this is actually the adding server command right here I have highlighted, is actually we're going to add a server, add the name of the remote server that we're adding. And in this case, if you can see what I have spelled out here, the remote server name is called Splunk Linux Test.local. The IP of that particular server, which is 10.20.28.108, the port number, which is typically 514 for syslog, but you don't necessarily have to use that. You can use a custom port number to make sure you're matching on both sides. And TCP or UDP protocol, depending on what your needs are. If you want some more error correcting within your stream of syslog, or if you want to use UDP. In my case, I'm actually going to use UDP, and actually some of mine are actually labeled TCP, and I'm going to change that right now. And we are going to basically add all of these um, to actually run all of these at our NCLI prompt. Just to kind of give you a brief overview of some of this is actually adding our server to the CVM at our NCLI prompt. And what happens is the next thing you actually have to do is actually add all the individual logs that you want to actually be sending over via syslog over to Splunk. And in our case, as you know, in Nutanix architecture, we have lots of different modules that make up our architecture. And we have like Cassandra, Cerebro, Curator, Genesis, Prism, Stargate, and Zookeeper. And so this is essentially is configuring these particular logs to send over at a level info, which is actually the most verbose level, because you could go info error or warning error. Um, and then we're also going to include those monitor logs, which is equals true. So now we're actually going to move on to actually opening up a putty session and running these and getting it configured. So now we're on to configuring it. As you can see here, I have a putty session up, and I'm actually going to be SSHing into one of my CVMs on the cluster, the Hyper-V cluster, so we can actually configure syslog. So let me log in here. All right. All right, we're logged in here, and the very first thing you want to do is actually disable syslog. You don't want to actually have it sending logs somewhere while we're configuring it. So I'm actually going to log into our NCLI prompt. If you notice, I was actually going to put my command in first, but you're going to make sure you open the NCLI, which is the Nutanix command line interface, which is just NCLI. And as you can see, it'll say welcome admin, and now you're at the actual NCLI prompt. Now I'm actually going to bring in my command, which is rsyslog-config set status equal enable equals false, which will actually disable syslog. At that point, our next command that we're going to actually run is actually adding the server itself, the server that we're actually going to be sending syslog data to. In our case, is going to be the Splunk instance. So I'm bringing that up right now, and as you can see, I just ran the command, and it's actually our syslog add server. The name of the syslog server, in our case, it's Splunk Linux Test.local. The IP address of the syslog server, which in this case, again, is Splunk, the port number, and then the network protocol that's being used. And in the case of my lab, I'm using UDP. So once you've actually added the server, you're not done yet. Um, as you know, as part of Nutanix, or many of you may know or not know, Nutanix has a lot of modules as part of our architecture. Modules that are include like Cassandra, Cerebral, and they control different aspects of our architecture. Genesis, Prism, Stargate, Zookeeper. And so what we have to actually do is configure each of those modules essentially to send their logs over to syslog server, in this case Splunk, over there, and what their log level is going to be. And the case is you want it to be the most verbose, so you can see all that information within Splunk. So we're going to set it to info, which is the most verbose, but you can also set it to warning or error, depending on how much information you want inside of Splunk. And then we're going to also include the monitor logs. So I'm going to quickly go through and actually add all the different ones on the screen. I actually have them all pre-ready to go. So you can kind of see how as I move along. As you can see, I just put in Cassandra. And then the next one I put in is Cerebral. And I just put in Curator. I'm doing this as fast as I can cut and paste. And I just put in Genesis. And now I just put in Prism. And I put in Stargate. And then one more to go. And that's Zookeeper. So now we've actually added all the modules and all the logs that we want to actually send to Splunk. Do you think we can enable it? Let's actually try. Oh, this is enabled. So at that point, logs are being sent over, but be aware it's actually not working as we speak. There's one thing we did miss, and what we did forget is actually add the listener inside of Splunk. So we're actually going to flip over there, add the listener, and then at that point, we're actually going to start actually hearing data. Typically, just so you know, UDP will not give you an error even if you didn't put the listener on Splunk, but if you do use TCP, which has a little bit more error correction and responsiveness, it will give you an error saying that it can't listen to TCP until you open that listener. So again, make sure you open that listener. I'm going to flip over and show you that now. And then we're actually, once that listener is enabled, we're actually going to be able to see that Splunk data and being ingested. Okay, so we're back at the Splunk dashboard here, and I'm going to configure my listener. You may notice that I've actually added something since our last, since my last recording. I've actually added the mobile access app, and I'll explain how that kind of ties into the Nutanix app and something cool you can do with um, mobility and looking at the Nutanix statistics. So, but we're here right now to actually configure the listener. So if we go to settings, data inputs. Now I'd pre-configured my listener because I'd actually wanted to show some data on this last segment. So I'm actually going to configure a dummy listener, but I'll show you my pre-configured listener, and then I'll actually do it at the dummy listener at another port number as an example. So as you can see here, here's my 514. My source type is Nutanix syslog, and it is enabled. But typically when you would create a UDP listener for essentially listening for that ingestion of data from the Nutanix cluster, the syslog data that we just configured, you'd go over here and click on New under UDP or TCP, depending on the protocol you wanted to use. I'm going to use a different port, hit 515. You don't have to put source name override or accept connections from, except if you want to do any lockdown on the accepts connection from, you hit next. This is the important part of the config. Very important, source type. Make sure you select Nutanix syslog. You can actually search for it in this little dialog. And if you cite Nutanix, you'll notice it'll have a drop down of a bunch of Nutanix items. You want to choose Nutanix syslog. The next one is the app context. You want to make sure it says Nutanix Prism app for Splunk. And under host, this is your choice, particularly typically IP is what's chosen because when it comes in, IP will show up on the as a host name. But if you want to use DNS, you just want to make sure all those hosts that you are that are referring to in there, those nodes are actually resolvable, and then it'll actually show up as actual names. Most people use IP, but again, that's personal preference. And then under index, you want to make sure you choose Nutanix. Again, everything's under the Nutanix index. You hit review, and then you hit submit. Once you hit submit, at that point, that connector will be created, and the next thing you want to do is actually enable that connector. And that typically is you go back into data inputs. If it would open, there we go. And I would go over to that UDP area, and I would click on enable, and at that point data would be starting ingesting. So hang tight, and now let's actually take a look at what's going on and all this data being ingested and some of the cool things you can do. Okay, so we're back at our Splunk dashboard screen, or main dashboard screen, and let's actually take a look at our fruit of what we actually did and see how it all comes together. So I'm actually going to click on the Nutanix Prism app for Splunk, and when it comes up, it's going to actually render all the information in here. A couple side notes while this is rendering. Be aware, if you're using a developer license or your free license to check this out with Splunk. Um, the ingestion of syslog data obviously takes away because you get only 500 megs a day of ingestion. So that does take away obviously of some of that ingestion. Also, anytime the refresh on your individual calls, REST calls that are happening to the Prism interface via Splunk are also taking away from those. So just be aware of that. In particular, I actually set mine all to 2 minutes and had mine run overnight, and they'd actually exceeded the Splunk the actual limit. So just be aware. In my case, I actually increased the limits a little bit more to 5 minutes in some cases, or architecture, I moved up to every 60 minutes. That's not something as I needed as often. That's kind of your judgment call. So as you can see here, we have our dashboard, which is actually rendering data. In this case, I actually have mine set to every 5 minutes, so all this data is live as of 5 minutes, whenever it particularly run. And again, if you look in the corner here, top left, you'll see the syslog. And this is where you can actually look at that syslog data. So I can click on Stargate and actually look at the last. And by default, the searches are set to the last hour, but you can always go in there and change those search criterias on the fly. And I'll actually show you that in a few moments. But as you can see here, I have a lot of events that are rendering up. And you can see here, this is all the stuff that has to do uh, with Stargate. Sorry about that. So, and then you can obviously do further searches on that. How you can actually go in here and edit searches, as you can see here, the last hour is on the search, but you can always change this criteria to anything you want. By default, all of them are set to the last hour. But if you ever want to go in and customize a search, you can actually say open in search. And that takes about a second or two here. There we go. And once it pops up, you can see here, it's actually showing me the actual search, which is the actual search query that it's using. And this is where you can actually further tweak it. So for example, if I wanted to further tweak it looking for a particular event, and then I could save it. Or for example, I wanted to change the not hour, but maybe all time or last 2 hours, I could do that. And once I've done that, I can actually save it or save as. And save as would actually just create a brand new search result or search view. What's really neat, which plays into that, is that when you do mobile access, and this is something cool we'll talk about in a couple moments, is that you'll be able to actually use some of these searches in mobile so you can actually look at them like and report views, which is really cool. So as you can see here, this is really easy to use and ingest. Other things you can do here, so actually we'll pop up on like Genesis here. There we go. A little slow to render. I should probably put more CPU and memory in my instance. But as you can see here, this is now looking at all the Genesis related stuff. And you can also do a search on all the data that's within the Nutanix index, which is great. So um, all this is great, and this is all consumable at the desktop. But let's say we're on the go. So having mobility is great. And currently, when you render the Prism interface, it actually works fairly well on a lot of the tablet devices like a Surface or an iPad. But if you start rendering these things on little mobile devices like iPhones and really small devices, they work, but they pop up a warning saying it's not really meant for these devices. And sometimes you just go in to take a quick look at something or acknowledge an alert. This kind of gives you a step closer to that. Um, at the end of this webcast, and after I'm done, yeah, I'm actually you'll see a little short video clip of my iPhone. And what I'm doing is comparing the web interface of Prism using Safari on iPhone to using the Splunk app, and then accessing actually our Prism dashboard within the Splunk app, which essentially is giving me this mobility, really nice views into looking into Prism. So essentially, we're enabling yourself for mobility. So something is really neat. You do need a particular plugin for that. It's called the Splunk add-in for mobile access. It is a free add-in to Splunk. And it's pretty easy. You install it. You have to enable SSL on your Splunk instance. And essentially, if you just enable SSL on the default instance, it will use a self-signed certificate. And again, once you go in here, there are some options you can go and configure around mobility and what you would display in there, etc. But again, gives you another point of access of looking at all that really cool data within Nutanix's app for Prism on Splunk. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to tweet me or hit me up on my blog. But it was great showing you this today, and enjoy Splunking.
Streets